Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a set of short stories written by the Danish author Isak Dinesen was the pen name. Karen Blixen, I think, was her actual name, but it's a set of short stories. The first short story is called Babette's Feast, and the second short story is called Sorrow-Acres. So I listened to these short stories as an audiobook. I don't think they've ever been printed together in a publication version, but someone put together an audiobook version of this of these two short stories together. It takes about 2.5 hours to listen to those two stories together, and they're read, beautifully read, by Colleen Dewhurst, who many of you may not recognize the name, but you would recognize the actress. She was a Canadian actress who played Marilla in the old Sullivan version of Anne of Green Gables. So a lot of you probably grew up hearing her. She's got a very kind of rich, raspy, distinctive voice, which works really, really well with Dinesen's prose. So just a little bit about the author. So she was actually kind of part of the aristocracy in Denmark in the 20th century. Died in 1962. I can't remember what year she was born, but her years of activity and writing are pretty much the first half of the 20th century. She wrote a memoir called Out of Africa in the 1930s, talking about her life in Africa, which was later turned into a pretty famous movie in the mid 80s. So some of you may have seen that film, which I've not read her memoir. I have seen the film. I've heard that it's based on, but it takes some liberties with. But she wrote a number of novels and short stories. Although she was Danish, a lot of her works were actually written in English or she translated into English. And two of those, probably the two most famous, I think, of her short stories are Babette's Feast and Sorrow-Acres. So I picked this up because I wanted to read Babette's Feast, because that was also made into a movie, I think in the 80s, maybe early 90s, and it is one of my favorite films. It's in the top 5 for me. I absolutely love that movie. It's a beautiful film, and I was curious to read the story that gave birth to that film. So I won't, again, go through every aspect of the film, but it's set in, I think all of her writings, except for her memoir, Out of Africa, are set in the 19th century or earlier. So she is a modern 20th century writer, but she has I don't know, kind of an old soul or spirit, and she's often playing with the tensions between the modern and the traditional, and old order and the new order of things. I'll talk about that more when I talk about the second short story, Sorrow-Acres, here in a moment. But the first story is set in 19th century Denmark, and in a very rural, removed village where these two sisters are living. They are actually the daughters of this old Lutheran kind of charismatic figure, this prophet preacher who formed a sect around himself. He was noted for his piety, and there's this kind of church that had formed. But eventually, that old man passes away. His two daughters, Martina and Philippa, he names after Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon, they kind of carry on his legacy, tend to the flock there, and there's this community of people in this little village, very remote, that are living out life together. Both Martina and Philippa, at different points, have kind of potential love interests that they are introduced to. One is a dashing young officer. The other is this French singer, who both kind of end up pulling away to this rural area for rest and refreshment, visiting family. They meet these girls, they fall in love with them, they've got beautiful voices and things, but the daughters end up turning away from that path, devoting themselves to their father, and the young men kind of disappear for many, many years. The first part of the short story is introducing those characters and walking us through those different events. And then it kind of fast forwards a number of decades. The two daughters are now old spinsters living in the house. They're on greatly reduced means. The kind of church that had formed around their father, now that he has passed away, has whittled down to a very small group of people. And these older people have often become sort of bitter, turned in on themselves. There's bickering, there's backfighting, there's betrayal that's taken place. And so these daughters are trying to figure out how to kind of manage their father's legacy, as it were, when out of nowhere, this French woman appears on their front doorstep, and her name is Babette. And she has a letter from the French singer that had been kind of courting or wooing one of the daughters years and years ago, asking for them to take her in. This is kind of taking place in the turmoils in France in the 1870s. And so she doesn't speak any Danish, but she's asking for a place to stay, and they say, well, we can't really pay you, but why don't you can live with us, just cook for us, and kind of tend house. We're getting older, we could use that help. And she says, I'd love to do that. And so the story kind of progresses from there, and they live very simple, kind of austere lives. And so they go on for a number of years. Babette becomes well known in the village. She becomes kind of part of that community and is well loved, but people don't really know a lot about her life or anything like that. And then one day, Babette gets a letter from a friend of hers or a relative back in France, and tells her that this lottery ticket that she had bought years ago and had always kind of renewed over the years has just come in, and she has won 10,000 francs, this kind of enormous sum. And so she asks her, Philippa and Martina, can I throw a feast for you guys and for this church community, just to show my thanks for your hospitality now that I have this money? And at first they're very uncertain about that because they don't like fancy things. They want to live very austerely. They're a little nervous about French cooking and what that might mean, but they realize how important this is to Babette, so they say, fine, okay, you can throw this feast for us. And she starts ordering all of this elaborate stuff. They deliver a live turtle and baskets of all these exotic foods and spices, and they don't know what's going on. And so the kind of driver of the story becomes this feast that Babette is going to throw for her friends and mistresses there that have cared for her, and she's showing her love to them. So much happens in this story, but what ends up kind of taking place is that Babette throws this incredible feast, and we get to meet again the young officer who had courted one of the daughters earlier in the story. He has an elderly relative who lives in the area. At this point in his career, he's a general now. He knows the court. He knows fine culture. And he hears about this feast because his aunt is one of the kind of faithful amongst the flock. They're invited to it. And so he becomes kind of the narrator for the feast. He's kind of the only one who really understands the depth of what's going on, because this feast that's provided is more than just a good meal. It's this kind of mystical experience. And what turns out is that Babette had been this amazing, renowned chef at the kind of top restaurant in Paris for many, many years. And when the revolution happened, she had to flee. But she is this amazing chef, this artist, whose meals would cost thousands of francs to eat. Who's using her gifts, using her creativity, using the money that she had won to give this elaborate, beautiful meal to these people that she has loved and who have loved her. And so the story ends up becoming this kind of exploration of the power, the transformative power of creativity and of beauty. And she presents herself not as a cook, but as an artist. And she has a very powerful speech at the end where she sort of talks about how she did this to show love and thanks to these people, but it's also kind of beyond that. She could not help but show that creativity and imaginativeness. And so the short story is this really beautiful and richly symbolic exploration of the transformative power of art, the healing power of art and creativity, the nature of an artist's work, austerity and opulence, and how we balance these things. What is something worth? Because she ends up spending all of the money that she won on this one meal to provide for her friends. So, it just introduces so many interesting questions about how do you weigh and think through the value of art, the value of creativity, the value of an experience, and the artist's craft and personality and spirit, and all of these things. So it's a really fascinating story. I haven't done justice to it in giving you that summary. You need to experience it yourself. And I was really struck reading the short story to find that this movie that I had loved so well is an extremely faithful adaptation. So if you're not a big reader, you could watch the film, or you could do both. I would encourage you to do both. You do get a few more details in the story than you do in the film, because they can kind of narrate some things in the story that don't really work from a film vantage point. But they do a great job of adapting it. So I really I love that movie. I love the short story. Very interesting. The second short story in this set is called Sorrow-Acres, and apparently this is one of Isak Dinesen's most famous short stories. She's basically taking a Danish folk tale and then giving her own version of it. So the kind of broad strokes of the story are something like this. This is taking place in the kind of 18th century Denmark. So you're at this point of transition from the old feudal order into the more modern Enlightenment age. And the story centers on this kind of pastoral setting where there's this Danish lord, and he, right at the harvest time, finds out that there is this young boy who has been accused of damaging some of his property, I think burning one of his barns or something like that. And the boy's mother comes to the Lord and pleads for him to show mercy on her son. And he says, well, I have to do justice. I'm the magistrate here. But he says, I'll kind of make a deal with you. If you can harvest this whole field of rye in one day, then I'll free your son. And that's a task, we're told, that would take men, 3 days to do. So it's kind of this Herculean, almost impossible task. And yet he gives this to her. If you can harvest this whole field in one day, then your son will be free. And so we get to see her undertake that task. Now, part of what Dinesen does to give her own flavor and spin to this story, so what ends up happening, spoiler alert, but what ends up happening is she's able to do it. She's able to harvest the whole field. It's this amazing feat, but at the cost of her life. She's so exhausted that she dies. So she's literally given her own life for the life of her son. And in a lot of, apparently, the tellings of this story, the Lord is cast as a very, kind of dark, malevolent figure. But in Dinesen's story, he's presented with a lot more nuance. And what she ends up doing, the story begins with this Lord's nephew, a young man named Adam, he's from Denmark, but he's been living in England, and he's been traveling in the European continent. He's kind of thinking about and aware of what's going on in America. So Adam represents kind of the new world, this Enlightenment way of thinking. And I think his name, Adam, is important. He's a new man, the beginner of this new humanity, as it were. Whereas the Lord represents an older way of thinking, this feudal, almost medieval framework. And they end up having this kind of philosophical discussion before this whole thing with the son and the mother comes up. So the story unfolds in a kind of a couple of different acts, and it ends up becoming an exploration of justice and the transition from one world to the next. And Dinesen doesn't kind of tie this up neatly for us and kind of give, black hats to the bad guys and white hats to the good guys. She's exploring in a very nuanced way how these different values relate to one another, how they balance one another, what is good about what was lost, what is good about what is new. And she's taking, again, this old Danish folktale, writing it in the 20th century, and giving her own spin on these things. And so it's a very complex story. I feel like there's a lot more I could understand about it, but I enjoyed it. It was interesting. It got me thinking. I would love to have had a chance to read it in a kind of discussion group and kind of work through it in that format. But overall, I really enjoyed her writing. I had not read anything from hers before, and I found both of these short stories worthwhile. Of the two, I definitely like Babette's Feast the most. Maybe that's because I kind of came to it loving and knowing the movie, but both are well worth reading. Fairly short, fairly digestible. You can read them in one sitting, but they give you a lot to think about, and you could definitely reread and reimagine them. So I would highly recommend you get your hands on both of those short stories, Babette's Feast and Sorrow-Acres by Isak Dinesen.